After the Japanese torpedo hits, the Lexington shudders like a living thing in pain. Below decks, I lead my damage control team into smoke-filled compartments, hoses blasting seawater against licking flames. Heat sears through my boots, steel groans around us, and aviation fuel leaks into the bilges like blood from a wound. We fight for hours, until the order comes to abandon ship. Standing on the destroyer's deck hours later, I watch my carrier erupt in a final, towering column of black smoke that rises toward the heavens like a funeral pyre. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got there, and why May 8th, 1942 became a day that changed the course of the Pacific War forever. 3 weeks earlier, I was Chief Petty Officer aboard the USS Lexington, what we called Lady Lex. She was one of America's most powerful aircraft carriers, 888 feet of steel and determination cutting through the Pacific swells. At 36,000 tons, she carried over 90 aircraft and nearly 3,000 souls. I'd served aboard her for 2 years, and she felt more like home than any house I'd ever known. The morning of April 15th found us steaming north from Pearl Harbor, part of Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher. Intelligence had picked up Japanese radio chatter suggesting something big was brewing in the South Pacific. Code breakers at Pearl were working overtime, piecing together fragments of enemy transmissions that painted a picture of Japanese expansion toward Australia. "Chief, what do you make of all this radio traffic?" asked Seaman First Class Johnson, one of my damage control specialists. We were running drills on the hangar deck, checking fire suppression systems and reviewing emergency procedures. "Means we're heading into something serious, Johnson," I replied, tightening a valve connection. "The Japanese have been pushing south since they took Rabaul. Now they're eyeing Port Moresby in New Guinea. If they get that, they can threaten Australia directly." What we didn't know then was that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had devised an ambitious plan called Operation Mo. The Japanese intended to seize Port Moresby and establish a seaplane base at Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. This would give them control of the Coral Sea and cut Australia's lifeline to America. By early May, our task force had joined with Admiral Aubrey Fitch's Task Force 11, centered around the USS Yorktown. Together, we represented America's last major carrier strength in the Pacific after the devastation at Pearl Harbor. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on every man aboard both ships. On May 3rd, we received word that Japanese Force Shad landed at Tulagi. The Yorktown immediately launched airstrikes, sinking several enemy vessels and seaplanes. It was our first blood, but we knew it was just the opening act. The morning of May 7th dawned gray and threatening. The Coral Sea stretched endlessly around us, its surface choppy under overcast skies that provided perfect cover for air operations. At 6:30, our search planes launched into the murk, fanning out across hundreds of square miles of ocean, hunting for the Japanese fleet. I was in Damage Control Central when the first contact report crackled over the intercom. Large enemy force bearing 225 degrees, distance 175 miles. 2 carriers, 4 cruisers, destroyers. The bridge erupted in controlled chaos. Admiral Fletcher immediately ordered airstrikes prepared. Within minutes, the flight deck above us thundered with the sound of aircraft engines warming up. 93 planes from both Lexington and Yorktown would form the largest American carrier strike yet launched in the Pacific War. But the Japanese had spotted us too. At 11 o'clock, radar picked up incoming bogies, 69 Japanese aircraft from the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, flying straight toward our task force. General Quarters. General Quarters. All hands manned battle stations. The alarm klaxon shattered the morning calm. I grabbed my helmet and life jacket, racing through corridors filled with sailors running to their stations. From Damage Control Central, I could hear but not see the air battle raging above. Our combat air patrol intercepted the Japanese attack formation 50 miles out, Wildcats tearing into enemy bombers with machine guns blazing. But some got through. The first bomb hit the Lexington at 11:18, a 250-pound explosive that punched through the flight deck and detonated in the Admiral's country. The ship lurched, steel fragments rattling through the superstructure like deadly hail. Damage reports flooded in over the sound-powered phones. Compartment A14L flooded and secured. Fire in officer's country, frame 90. Steering control reports minor damage. We were hurt, but Lady Lex was still fighting. Our own strike force had found the Japanese light carrier Shoho that same morning, overwhelming her with dive bombers and torpedo planes. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon's famous radio call echoed through the fleet. Scratch one flat top. The 11,000-ton Shoho went down with all hands, the first Japanese carrier sunk by American forces. But the real test was yet to come. May 8, 1942. The date burned into the memory of every man who sailed in the Coral Sea that day. Dawn came gray and humid, the air thick with moisture and tension. Both fleets had spent the night maneuvering, trying to gain position for the decisive strike. At 9 o'clock, our search planes located the main Japanese carrier force, the Shokaku and Zuikaku, protected by cruisers and destroyers. These were first-line fleet carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids. Each carried over 70 aircraft and represented the cutting edge of Japanese naval aviation. Admiral Fletcher didn't hesitate. Launch everything we've got. The flight deck became a symphony of organized chaos. Dauntless dive bombers, their wings heavy with 1,000-pound bombs, taxied into position. Devastator torpedo bombers, their big radial engines coughing to life, lined up behind them. Wildcat fighters weaved between the bombers, pilots checking guns and instruments one final time. From my station below, I could feel each aircraft as it thundered down the deck and lifted into the gray sky. 75 planes from Lexington and Yorktown carrying the hopes of the Pacific Fleet on their wings. But the Japanese were launching too. At 10:30, radar detected another massive enemy formation, 70 aircraft from both enemy carriers, racing toward us across the empty sea. Here they come again, I muttered, checking our damage control readiness. Every man in my section knew his job. We drilled for this moment countless times, but drills couldn't prepare you for the reality of combat at sea. The first Japanese planes appeared as dots on the horizon at 11:18. Our fighter cover rose to meet them, but the enemy had learned from the previous day's battle. They came in at different altitudes, coordinating their attacks to overwhelm our defenses. High above, K torpedo bombers split into two groups, approaching from both sides of the ship. Meanwhile, Val dive bombers climbed to attack altitude, their pilots searching for the perfect angle to pierce our flight deck with armor-piercing bombs. Multiple bogies inbound. The radar operator's voice cracked over the intercom. Torpedo planes attacking from starboard. I felt the ship's massive engines respond as Captain Frederick Sherman ordered flank speed and began evasive maneuvers. The Lexington heeled over in a hard turn to port, her 180,000 horsepower plant driving her through the water at over 30 knots. The first torpedo bomber came in low, skimming the wave tops at 200 knots. Our 5-inch guns opened up, filling the sky with black bursts of flak. The smaller 20 and 40 millimeter guns joined in, creating a curtain of steel that no aircraft should have been able to penetrate. But Japanese naval aviators were among the best trained in the world. They pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. At 11:20, I felt the first torpedo hit. The explosion lifted the entire forward section of the ship, a tremendous underwater blast that bent steel plates and ruptured fuel lines. In Damage Control Central, we were thrown against bulkheads as the shock wave traveled through Lady Lex's hull. Torpedo hit. Port side forward. Came the report from the bridge. Heavy flooding in compartments 7 through 12. I grabbed my damage control party and headed forward, emergency lighting casting eerie shadows in corridors already filling with smoke. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel mixed with seawater and cordite created a toxic fog that burned our lungs with every breath. "Johnson, get that pump rigged!" I shouted over the noise of rushing water and groaning steel. "Martinez, check the fuel manifolds. We need to stop that leak." But even as we fought the first damage, more attacks were coming in. Through the hull, I could hear our anti-aircraft guns maintaining a steady barrage. The 5-inch mounts thundered every few seconds, their shells exploding among the enemy formations high above. At 11:27, the second torpedo hit. This one struck amidships on the port side, directly below the island superstructure. The explosion was tremendous, lifting the flight deck and buckling steel plates throughout the ship's midsection. In the forward engine room, high-pressure steam lines ruptured, scalding several sailors and reducing our power output. "We're losing steam pressure in boiler room number 3, came the report. "Can't maintain flank speed." Without full power, we were a sitting duck. Captain Sherman continued evasive maneuvers, but the big carrier couldn't dance like a destroyer. She was hurt, bleeding fuel and seawater, her massive bulk becoming a liability in the confined waters of the Coral Sea. The dive bombers attacked next, screaming down from 8,000 feet in near vertical dives that challenged every law of physics and human endurance. Their 250-kilogram bombs, designed to penetrate armored decks, struck with devastating effect. The first bomb hit the flight deck near the forward elevator, punching through to the hangar deck below and detonating among parked aircraft. Suddenly, we were fighting not just flooding and mechanical damage, but fire. Aviation fuel is the devil's own brew, highly volatile, burns incredibly hot, and spreads like liquid death through any opening it can find. The bomb blast had ruptured fuel lines throughout the forward hangar bay, and now 100-octane gasoline was pouring into the bilges. "Chief, we've got fires on the hangar deck." Petty Officer Williams appeared through the smoke, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "The sprinkler system's damaged, and we can't get enough pressure to the hoses." I looked around at my damage control party, 20 men who'd trained together for months, good sailors who trusted me to get them through this nightmare. Their faces showed fear, sure, but also determination. They were Americans, and they wouldn't give up their ship without a fight. "All right, listen up." I gathered them around me in the smoke-filled corridor. "We're going to fight these fires section by section. Williams, take 5 men and get portable pumps rigged in compartment 12. Johnson, I need you to isolate the fuel manifolds forward, shut down everything that's not essential." For the next 2 hours, we fought the most desperate battle of our lives. Not against enemy ships or aircraft, but against the sea itself and the fires that threatened to consume our ship from within. We rigged portable pumps and dragged fire hoses through compartments filled with toxic smoke. We shored up weakened bulkheads with timbers and steel plates. We sealed off flooded sections and rerouted essential services around damaged areas. All the while, Lady Lex continued to fight. Her aircraft were still launching and recovering, her guns still firing at any Japanese plane that came within range. Despite massive damage, she remained an operational aircraft carrier, but the fires were winning. While we battled damage below, our own airstrike was hitting the Japanese fleet 100 miles away. Our dive bombers found the Shokaku first, punching 3 bombs through her flight deck and starting massive fires that put her out of action for months. The Zuikaku escaped into a rain squall, but not before losing dozens of aircraft to our fighters and anti-aircraft fire. When our planes finally returned, they brought news of significant damage to the enemy fleet. "We got them, Chief," Lieutenant Commander Thatch reported when he landed his fighter back aboard. "The Shokaku's burning like a torch, and we shot down at least 30 of their planes." It should have been a moment of triumph, but by 2:45 our internal battles were reaching a crisis point. The aviation fuel leaking into the bilges had been slowly vaporizing, creating a massive bomb waiting for the right spark. At 12:47 it found one. The explosion was tremendous, a blast that lifted the entire midsection of the ship and opened seams throughout her hull. It wasn't an enemy weapon that nearly destroyed us. It was our own fuel vapors igniting in a fireball that raced through the ship's internal spaces. The blast killed 25 men instantly and wounded dozens more. More critically, it ruptured the main fuel storage tanks and started fires that quickly spread beyond our ability to control. "All damage control parties to stations." I called over the sound-powered phones, but we were already stretched to the breaking point. We had men fighting fires in 6 different locations, pumping water out of flooded compartments, and trying to maintain power to essential systems. The ship began to list to port as more compartments flooded. Our speed torpedoed 22 knots, then 18, then 15. With each reduction, we became more vulnerable to submarine attack and less able to conduct flight operations. At 4:30, Captain Sherman made the hardest decision any naval officer can face: prepare to abandon ship. The order hit us like a physical blow. "Abandon the Lexington?" She was more than a ship. She was home, fortress, and symbol of American naval power, all rolled into 36,000 tons of fighting steel. But Captain Sherman was right. The fires were now beyond our control, threatening the aviation fuel storage tanks and potentially the ship's magazines. If those went up, the explosion would be visible from Australia. The evacuation was conducted with typical American efficiency and courage. The wounded were transferred first, loaded onto stretchers and carried to the flight deck, where destroyers came alongside to take them off. Then came the ship's records, classified materials, and personal effects. Throughout it all, volunteer damage control parties remained below, fighting fires and manning pumps to give their shipmates more time to escape. I was part of the last group to leave our stations, making sure every compartment was checked, every man accounted for. At 5:10, I climbed to the flight deck for the last time. What I saw there broke my heart. Lady Lex was dying. Massive fires raged from bow to stern, sending columns of black smoke thousands of feet into the sky. Her flight deck, once perfect and pristine, was buckled and twisted from internal explosions. The proud island superstructure, where her battle flags still flew, was shrouded in smoke and flame. But even in death, she was magnificent. Over the side, Chief. Captain Sherman appeared beside me, his face streaked with smoke and exhaustion. The destroyers are standing by. I took one last look around the flight deck, where I'd spent so many hours, then climbed over the side into the cargo nets that hung down to the waiting rescue boats. The water of the Coral Sea was warm against my body as I dropped the final few feet, but I felt cold inside. From the deck of the destroyer USS Phelps, I watched the final act of the Lexington's drama. At 8 o'clock, Captain Sherman gave the order to scuttle her rather than let her fall into enemy hands or become a navigation hazard. The destroyer USS Phelps fired 5 torpedoes into Lady Lex's starboard side. It took 3 hits before she began her final dive, settling slowly by the stern as fires still raged throughout her hull. At 8:56 on May 8, 1942, the USS Lexington slipped beneath the waters of the Coral Sea. Her battle flags were still flying. In the immediate aftermath, it seemed like we'd lost. The Japanese could claim they'd sunk a major American aircraft carrier while losing only the light carrier Shoho. Their larger ships, Shokaku and Zuikaku, had survived to fight another day. But wars aren't won by simple accounting of ships sunk and planes shot down. They're won by achieving strategic objectives and maintaining the initiative. The Japanese had failed to take Port Moresby. Their invasion force, deprived of air cover after their carriers were damaged and their aircraft squadrons decimated, turned back without achieving their primary objective. Australia remained secure, the lifeline to America intact. More importantly, we'd proven that American carriers could stand toe-to-toe with the best the Japanese Navy could throw at us. Yes, we'd lost Lady Lex, but we'd bloodied the enemy's nose in the process. Out of 127 Japanese aircraft that participated in the battle, 77 were shot down or damaged beyond repair. Those were experienced pilots and aircrew, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean who couldn't be easily replaced. The strategic implications became clear just 1 month later at Midway, where the absence of the Shokaku and Zuikaku, still under repair from Coral Sea damage, contributed directly to the Japanese defeat. Had those 2 carriers been present at Midway, the outcome might have been very different. Standing on the destroyer's deck as we sailed away from the Coral Sea, I thought about the men we'd lost. 216 sailors had died when the Lexington went down, good men who'd given their lives for something bigger than themselves. But their sacrifice hadn't been in vain. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, we'd met the Japanese fleet in open battle and held our own. We'd shown that American industry could build ships and planes to match the enemy's best, and American sailors could fight with courage equal to any in the world. The Battle of the Coral Sea was the first naval engagement in history where surface ships never came within sight of each other. It was fought entirely by aircraft, a new kind of warfare that would define the rest of the Pacific conflict. From a tactical standpoint, the Japanese could claim victory. They'd sunk more tonnage than they'd lost. But strategically, we'd won decisively. The threat to Port Moresby was ended, Australia was secure, and the Japanese advance southward was permanently halted. More than that, we'd learned how to fight carrier battles. The coordination between Lexington and Yorktown, the integration of fighter cover with strike aircraft, the damage control procedures that kept us fighting long after we should have been dead, all of these lessons would be applied at Midway, in the Philippine Sea, and at Lake Gulf. The Japanese had reached the high water mark of their expansion. From May 8, 1942 forward, they would be fighting a defensive war against an enemy that was learning, adapting, and growing stronger with every passing month. I served aboard 3 more carriers before the war ended, the Essex, the Intrepid, and finally the Hornet. I was at Midway when we sank 4 Japanese carriers in one day. I was in the Philippinesia when we destroyed what remained of Japanese naval aviation. I was at Lake Gulf when we broke the back of the Imperial Navy forever. But no battle meant more to me than the Coral Sea, and no ship meant more than Lady Lex. She'd been built in the 1920s as a battle cruiser, converted to a carrier when the Washington Naval Treaty limited battleship construction. For 20 years, she'd served as the backbone of American naval aviation, training the pilots and developing the tactics that would ultimately win the Pacific War. When the test came, she was ready. Her aircraft struck the first decisive blow against Japanese expansion. Her crew fought with courage and skill that earned the respect of enemies and allies alike. And when her time came to die, she did so with honor, taking enemy secrets to the bottom and denying them the prize of her capture. The men who served aboard the Lexington came from every corner of America. Farm boys from Iowa, city kids from New York, oil workers from Texas, and fishermen from Maine. The Navy had taken this diverse group and welded them into a fighting unit that could stand against the best in the world. Seaman Johnson, who'd asked me about the radio traffic 3 weeks earlier, was among those lost when the forward magazines exploded. He was 19 years old from a small town in Nebraska, and he'd joined the Navy to see the world. He saw more of it than most, and he gave his life defending it from those who would have enslaved it. Petty Officer Williams, who'd helped fight the fires on the hangar deck, survived the war and became a Master Chief. After the war, he told me that May 8, 1942, was both the longest and shortest day of his life. Longest because every minute felt like an hour when we were fighting for the ship. Shortest because 20 years of peacetime service never matched the intensity of those few hours in combat. Lieutenant Commander Thatch, the fighter pilot who'd led our air cover, went on to develop new tactics that revolutionized naval aviation. The Thatch weave, perfected over the Coral Sea, became standard doctrine for fighter operations and saved countless American lives in subsequent battles. Captain Sherman, who'd made the painful decision to abandon his ship, went on to command a carrier division in later battles. He never spoke publicly about losing the Lexington, but those who served under him knew that May 8th had changed him. He'd learned that command sometimes meant making choices no man should have to make and living with the consequences. Looking back from the perspective of victory, it's easy to see the Battle of the Coral Sea as inevitable, just one more step on the road to Tokyo Bay. But for those of us who lived through it, the outcome was never certain. In May 1942, America was still reeling from Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. The Japanese seemed unstoppable, their naval aviation the finest in the world, their strategy flawless in its execution. We were fighting with pre-war equipment and peacetime training against an enemy that had been preparing for this war for a decade. But we had advantages the Japanese didn't fully understand. We had industrial capacity that could replace our losses faster than they could sink our ships. We had a population that was genuinely united in a common cause. Most importantly, we had leaders who could learn from mistakes and adapt to new circumstances. The Japanese, for all their early successes, were fighting a war of limited objectives with limited resources. They needed to win quickly and decisively, then negotiate from a position of strength. Every month the war continued worked against them, and the Coral Sea marked the beginning of their decline. At Midway, just 1 month later, we sank 4 fleet carriers and broke the back of Japanese naval aviation. At Guadalcanal, we learned how to fight a grinding campaign of attrition that wore down their best pilots and aircraft. In the Philippine Sea, we destroyed what remained of their carrier force in the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. each victory built on lessons learned in previous battles. And it all started in the Coral Sea, where Lady Lex and her crew proved that Americans could fight and win against the best the enemy could offer. War extracts a price from everyone who fights it, victor and vanquished alike. For those of us who served aboard the Lexington, that price was measured not just in lives lost, but in innocence destroyed and certainties shattered. Before May 8, 1942, I'd been a career sailor who thought he understood war from books and training exercises. After that day, I knew that war was chaos barely contained by training and courage, where good men died for reasons that made sense only in the larger context of history. I'd seen shipmates burned beyond recognition by aviation fuel fires. I'd heard the screams of men trapped in flooding compartments. I'd watched a magnificent ship die slowly, fighting to the end against enemies both external and internal. But I'd also seen ordinary men rise to extraordinary heights when the moment demanded it. I'd watched sailors risk their lives to save shipmates they barely knew. I'd seen officers make decisions that would haunt them forever, but which were necessary for the greater good. Most of all, I'd learned that freedom isn't free, and democracy isn't guaranteed. Both require constant vigilance and, when necessary, the willingness to fight and die for something larger than ourselves. The men who died aboard the Lexington understood this. They were mostly young, many of them barely out of high school, but they grasped instinctively what was at stake in the Pacific. They were fighting not just for America, but for a world where people could choose their own governments and live their own lives. That's a cause worth dying for, and 216 good men proved it on May 8, 1942. Today, the USS Lexington rests in 10,000 feet of water in the Coral Sea, her hull broken but her spirit undefeated. In 2018, a research vessel located her wreck, finding her surprisingly well preserved in the cold, dark depths of the Pacific. The photos from that expedition showed Lady Lex much as she was on her final day. Her aircraft elevators still visible, her anti-aircraft guns still trained skyward, ready to fight an enemy that no longer exists. It was both heartbreaking and inspiring to see her again, a steel monument to American determination and sacrifice. But the real monument to the Lexington and her crew isn't on the ocean floor. It's the world we helped create through our sacrifice, a world where democracy survived its greatest test, where freedom triumphed over tyranny, where the right of people to govern themselves was preserved for future generations. That world isn't perfect. It never will be, because perfection isn't within human reach. But it's a world where people have choices, where progress is possible, where the strong are restrained by law and the weak are protected by justice. Creating and preserving that world required the sacrifice of many, not just the 216 men who died with Lady Lex, but millions of others who gave their lives in the cause of freedom. We who survived have an obligation to ensure their sacrifice wasn't in vain. Sometimes, late at night, I can still feel the deck of the Lexington beneath my feet. I can hear the steady thrum of her engines, the whistle of wind across her flight deck, the controlled chaos of aircraft operations. In my dreams, she's still out there somewhere, steaming through endless blue waters with her battle flags flying and her crew at their stations. Young men with bright eyes and uncertain futures, ready to face whatever challenges await them over the horizon. They don't know yet about the torpedo hits, the fires, or the final explosion that will send their ship to the bottom. They don't know about the pain and loss that lie ahead, or the ultimate victory their sacrifice will help achieve. They only know their duty to stand their watches, maintain their equipment, and be ready when their country calls upon them to fight. It's a simple creed, but one that has preserved freedom through humanity's darkest hours. The Battle of the Coral Sea taught us that wars aren't won by the biggest ships or the most advanced weapons. They're won by ordinary people who find the courage to do extraordinary things when history demands it. Lady Lex and her crew answered that demand on May 8, 1942. They fought with everything they had, held nothing back, and gave their lives for a cause greater than themselves. In doing so, they helped turn the tide of war and preserve the freedoms we enjoy today. Their voyage continues, even now. Every time someone stands up for what's right, Every time democracy triumphs over tyranny, every time freedom wins another victory over oppression, the spirit of the Lexington sails on. She was a ship, yes, steel and machinery and human ingenuity combined into an instrument of war. But Al saw something more, a symbol of American resolve, a testament to the power of free people united in a common cause. That's her real legacy, and it's one that will endure long after the last survivor has joined his shipmates in whatever port awaits us all. The USS Lexington, Lady Lex, lives on in the freedoms she died defending, and in the hearts of those who remember her sacrifice. Fair winds and following cease. Old girl, your watch is ended, but your memory endures forever.